Yeah, alpha. Okay, cool. So, hello everyone to the second round of this year of the Deep Learning Theory Seminar. So today I have the pleasure of inviting Juno Kim. So Juno is just a master's student, so it's pretty impressive, I think, in University of Tokyo, and we met at, I believe, at NeurIPS, a pretty cool poster. So today he's going to be talking about the transformers and Minimax upload non-parametric in context learners. So after you, Juno.
Right. Okay. Thanks for having me.
Mhm.
So I'll be presenting this paper. Let me say this again. It's transformers are minimax optimal non-parametric in-context learners. So we're studying both in-context learning and also from a statistical learning theory perspective. We want to show some optimality results. This paper was presented in Europe 2024, and I'm the first author. And this was also done together with another student, Tai, and also my supervisor, Taiji, at the University of Tokyo. All right. So let me see if I can. Great. So this is the table of contents, and let's dive into the introduction. So, okay. So there's nothing covering the screen right now, right? Because I
No,
need this.
it's all good. I mean, seems like it's all good.
Okay. So I guess you've all heard of in-context learning by now, but in-context learning is the ability of a pre-trained model, typically an LLM, to perform a completely new task by being provided with a few examples within the context of a prompt without any additional parameter updates. Basically, it should be able to perform this new task without actually being trained on this new task. And it's been shown that LLMs require only a few examples to consistently achieve high performance for in-context learning. Uh, so one example is this sentiment analysis task. That's this picture below. The model is given a sentence and a evaluation whether it is positive or negative. And then given these examples and a new task, a new sentiment, the model can analyze whether it is positive and negative. Uh, so LLMs only require a few examples to do this, but it's also been shown that sufficient pre-training task diversity is required for ICL to generalize well. Basically, it means that it needs to look at a wide variety of tasks in order to be able to have this ability to learn a new task. And so we want to study this from a rigorous theoretical perspective. Now, previous works on in-context learning, ICL, have studied this by equating ICL with gradient descent by giving very specific transformer constructions in a multi-layer setting, which implement gradient descent internally. However, it has been pointed out by some other works that this is unlikely to be happening in real-world models. There have also been some dynamical analysis of in-context learning. Sorry. Okay. Mostly restricted to a single linear self-attention layer pre-trained on linear regression tasks. These works obtain convergence guarantees or generalization bounds with respect to this simple model. And here I'll spend some time to explain the general idea behind these works. So suppose we have data x1 to xn that are sampled from a Gaussian distribution with covariance matrix sigma, and our tasks are of the form y equals v transpose x, where v is the task vector and it can vary depending on the task. So for each task, the attention layer computes, where we combine the query and Q matrix into gamma, the following equation. So you can see here that y hat is the average of yi times this. Sorry, let me just use this. Okay. So you're looking at a simplified model of attention where the values only look at the y values and the x's are used to compute the attention scores. So is everybody okay with this? This is like a simplified version of attention. Here gamma is the query and keys combined. Anyway, so given this computation, what we can do is we can put y equals v transpose xi here, and then rearrange the terms so that the computation looks like this. And you can see that this part actually will converge to the covariance matrix sigma of the data. So the computation of the attention layer is basically just doing this computation. And the idea is that by doing gradient descent, you can actually show that the model, the parameter gamma converges to learn sigma inverse. So these parts cancel out. And so the model will automatically learn to compute v transpose x for a new query x tilde, and you can do this for a completely new task v as well. So this is the basic idea behind how in-context learning happens for a single attention layer and linear regression tasks. Okay. Now, we want to go beyond this linear regression setting and study the optimality of ICL from a more like non-parametric regression statistical setting. In order to do this, we study a transformer consisting of not just a single linear attention layer, but also the feed-forward layers, which are followed by an attention layer. And this transform will be pre-trained on n samples from t regression tasks. And in our paper, we aim to obtain upper and lower bounds for the in-context learning error for the empirical risk minimizer of the transform model. We want to obtain bounds on both n and t, and assess whether these bounds are optimal or not. So compared to previous works that do this linear attention setup, we take a key step towards more practical models by incorporating the nonlinear feed-forward layers. Just to be clear, this paper, so after this paper was published, there have been also other papers that also incorporate the feed-forward layers that do some sort of feature learning or extraction, but none of them have covered deep learning, deep neural networks. So that's the contribution of our paper. So let's go on to the function class and the model setup. Let's describe the task you're faced with first. So we assume we have an input space that is d-dimensional, x. It has its own distribution px. We also assume a basis, basis of functions psi j in the L2 space of x. And we also consider a coefficient sequence beta. And our task class is as follows. We consider functions that are linear combinations of the basis functions with respect to the coefficient sequence beta. And beta has its own distribution. So we can sample a random function from this task class by sampling a random sequence beta. And we assume that each task prompt for this in-context learning setup contains n example input-output response pairs. Here, xk and yk are the input-output responses, where xk is just a sample IID from its distribution on x, and yk is sampled from this nonlinear regression function. So f beta is our target function, and psi k is a bounded noise. There's a caveat here. We assume the noise is bounded instead of Gaussian. This is just to simplify the analysis. Okay. And there are some assumptions on this basis. Let me just, okay. So the general idea is that this basis needs to be close to orthonormal, but we relax the condition a bit. So we assume the basis to be partially independent, and those partially independent components need to be close to orthonormal, in the sense that there exists integers n underbar and overbar, so that the set of basis functions from n underbar to n overbar, so there are n functions here for any integer n. We have a sequence of n basis functions which are independent, and so that their covariance matrix sigma psi is close to is upper and lower bounded by the adjoint matrices. We also assume that the L infinity norm of the sum of the basis elements squared are bounded by n to the power of 2r. So these are kind a bit complicated, but just bear with me for a moment, and I'll try to get the intuition about this right after this slide. So what we're saying here, this is just a generalized version of orthonormality, because in the case that, in the case that phi j is just an orthonormal basis for the L2 function, you can just set n underbar to 1 and n overbar to n, so that these are just the first n functions. So we're basically saying the first n functions are independent and nearly orthonormal. But why we do this kind of more complicated setup is that we want to allow for also hierarchical basis systems with dependencies, such as the spline system that we will use later. Basically, the spline system looks like the functions here. It's ordered in terms of the so-called resolution. And at each resolution, so this is resolution 1, this is resolution 2, this is resolution 3, and so on. And the functions at each resolution, at each level, are independent, but the functions at different levels are not independent. So we want to incorporate these systems as well. But if this is a bit complicated, then just have the orthonormal example in mind. Okay. And we also want a decay rate on the function class as well. So let's begin with our task function f beta, if you remember, is a linear combination of our basis functions. And this f beta n is basically the n basis truncation, where we just throw away everything after the n basis. And the main thing is that we assume that the L2 error of this truncation is bounded as n to the power of minus 2s. So intuitively, this is like a smoothness condition for a task class. So for example, if this is Sobolev space, you know that you have this Fourier basis, and then if you truncate it after n terms, you have this decay rate of n to the minus 2s, where s is the smoothness of your Sobolev space. So that's the example to keep in mind.
One question or a comment, I guess. Yeah, but I guess your analysis can be modified to have exponential decay, so like analytic functions kind of thing.
Oh yes, you could do exponential decay.
Okay, cool. I mean, I don't see why not, but okay, cool.
But I guess the main example to have in mind right now is just when the task class is the Helder class or the Sobolev class, and then S is just the smoothness.
Yeah, cool.
And these sorry about the whole like notation is a bit complicated because of this. Like we want to also incorporate like hierarchical basis. But basically, you can have the Fourier example in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And the second condition on this sigma beta is basically the covariance matrix for your coefficient sequence beta. And we also assume it decays at a speed of, say, n to the minus 2s minus 1. And this is, you can view this as basically saying the same thing, but this is an L2 and this is an expectation of beta. Okay. So let's move on to the transform model. So the transform model, what it does is it takes n input-output pairs, x1, y1 to xn, yn, where y is again generated from a random regression function f beta, randomly sampled from target class. The transform also gets a query x tilde and needs to return a prediction for the corresponding f beta of tilde. Oh, sorry, f beta of tilde x. And for a model, we consider a transformer that consists of a DNN followed by an attention layer. So the covariates x values are first passed through a DNN, a deep neural network, which we denote here as phi. The phi is an we assume that the output of phi is n-dimensional, where large n is an integer. And so basically, we will take this n input-output pairs and the x tilde, the query, and gather them into this matrix E. This is called the prompt embedding matrix. And then we assume that when this is passed through the DNN layer, all the x values are transformed into phi x, phi x1, phi xn, and the x tilde is also transformed into phi x tilde. And the y values we assume just stay the same for simplicity. And we assume that this DNN class Fn is also suitably expressive in the sense that for each basis function psi j, we assume there exists a DNN in the class Fn that suitably approximates this function up to some error delta. And these are all very abstract quantities, but we will evaluate them explicitly later. Sorry, I skipped the slide. Okay. So back to the transformer. The transformer gets this prompt embedding matrix, which is transformed by the MLP into this matrix, and then this is pushed through the linear attention layer. And again, here we combine the key and query matrix into a single matrix gamma, which we assume is also bounded spectrally. And we also assume that the value matrix is fixed to this matrix, so that the value only looks at y. So this is the same thing as before, just that the x values are transformed by the DNN first. Okay, so the output of the linear attention layer, when all is said and done, can be written as this inner product. And finally, what we do, this is just for technical reasons, is we clip this output Where basically, if the value is bigger than a certain threshold b or smaller than a certain threshold minus b, we just clip it to plus b or minus b. And we also assume that the target function is also bounded in L infinity. Now, so this is our model, and we assume that during pre-training, the model is presented with T prompts generated from T IID tasks. So the tasks f beta 1 to f beta t are all generated randomly from our task class. And then for each task, we get n IID input-output examples, x1 to x1 y1 to xn yn, and also the x tilde query for each task. And for each task, we do the computation from before and take that as our prediction for the corresponding y tilde. And then we compute the L2 error. We compute the empirical L2 error. And this is our loss function that the transformer is going to be trained on. Now, recall that the parameters of the transformer are gamma, which is the key inquiry matrix of the attention layer, and also phi, which is all the parameters in the deep neural network. So we assume that the transformer can be trained to completely minimize this empirical risk. Here, we do not consider the optimizing dynamics of this model because the optimizing dynamics of a DNN are very hard to analyze. But we do a similar optimization analysis when the DNN is a shallow feed-forward neural network in our ICML paper. That is. So you can go check that out if you're interested in the optimization dynamics. But here we just assume that the transformer can learn the empirical risk minimizer, and then we want to analyze the expected risk. Okay. So basically, the expected risk, once we learn this, the empirical risk minimizer theta hat, we want to evaluate its expected error on a completely new random regression task, f beta, which is sampled again from our target class. And also the x, y, and x tilde, the queries are all randomly sampled again from the same procedure. So we want to evaluate this mean squared risk, which we denote here as r bar. Recall that, sorry, the control a little bit more difficult than I'm used to. Recall that r without this r hat is the empirical risk, and r bar is the population or expected risk. Now, to analyze this expected risk, we start with a basic oracle inequality. This basically says that r bar can be bounded by an infimum of r plus a generalization error term, which depends on the entropy of your function class. Here, our function class is, we don't here as Tn, is the product of the space of matrices, the space of protection matrices, and the DNN class at n. So we have the entropy of this class here. We have 1 over t, because t is the number of different pre-training tasks that we can look at. And then we have the approximation error here. And so this is a very classical result. I just applied to the encoding learning setting. And now we want to evaluate both of these terms. So for the approximation error, we consider a very specific choice of the transform parameters. We consider gamma to be the inverse covariance matrix of the basis functions, sigma of psi. And for phi, we assume we take a DNN approximator of all the basis functions. So this matrix you can intuitively see as we're doing basically the same thing as the linear attention from before, where the attention matrix will approximate the covariance matrix of the data. But now the data is transformed by this basis functions psi. So if we take this choice and analyze the R value, the risk for this particular set of parameters, we can get this rather long upper bound. And I won't go through the details, but basically the intuition is that you approximate the task function by an n-term truncation. You approximate the basis by the best approximation in the DNN class. And this approximation will incur n to the minus 2s, which is the decay rate. And this approximation here will incur the abstract error, the abstract approximation error, delta n, which we assumed from before. So that results in these three terms. The remaining three terms here of the order 1 over small n, where n is the prompt length, these arise from the concentration of the n token representations side to the true covariance matrix. For the entropy, we also show an upper bound of the following form. This is very easy. This is because the first term is the covering entropy. Oh, sorry. So by entropy, I mean the log covering number. So the first is the log covering number of the attention matrix, which is the side of n squared. And the second term is the covering number of the DNN class. So with this bounds in mind, and so this term delta n and this entropy of the DNN class, we haven't computed yet because we haven't actually given a concrete class to evaluate yet. But with this decomposition, so far, what we have shown is this general upper bound for the expected risk. So again, just as a brief reminder, large N is the width of the DNN. Small n is the number of in-context samples in a single prompt or a single task, and t is the number of tasks provided during pretraining. So thus far, we have shown that the upper bound consists of all these terms. And if you look closely, the first three terms only depend on large n. So this is kind of a DNN approximation error, which goes to 0 if the DNN becomes more and more powerful. The next three terms are all like 1 over small n. So these go to 0 as the number of in-context samples, the prompt lengths go to infinity. So the next three terms can be seen as a sort of in-context generalization error. And the final three terms are all like 1 over t. So basically, they go to 0 as the number of pre-training tasks goes to infinity. So we can call this the pre-training generalization error. So we have this three different terms. In comparison, for ordinary supervised regression, we would have just the approximation error versus just the generalization error. Now, with this abstract bound in mind, we can actually think about a concrete DNN class and a concrete task class to compute all these like delta quantities, this covering entropy, to actually get a concrete upper bound. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to consider the class of Brillo deep neural networks with depth L.
Sorry, could you just flash back for 1 microsecond?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, never mind. Okay, no, cool. Yeah, yeah, I'm good. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
I think yes.
So yeah, so now we will consider a concrete class of deep neural networks, depth L with W sparsity S basically means how many parameters of your DNN are actually non-zero, and a norm bound M. The ReLU activation here is written as eta. And so this is just your standard deep neural network. And while we do this, the class of deep neural networks, the approximation abilities of deep neural networks can be captured by the Besov space, which again is a general class of functions, including the Helder and Zola spaces. And so if you're not familiar with Besov space, it takes some time to set up, so I won't go too much into details. But basically, the Besov space has, sorry, there's a typo here, has three parameters, p, q, and alpha. And p and q are all positive real numbers, and alpha is basically the smoothness. It corresponds to, say, the smoothness in Zola spaces. And so I'll just skip over the definition for now, but if you're curious, you can always come back to it. So the Besov space has three parameters, alpha and p and q. Alpha is basically the smoothness, and p and q give a bit more fine control over how the smoothness needs to be spread over the entire space. You denote the unit ball in the Besov space with respect to the Besov norm as u of the Besov space, and it generalizes the classical smoothness function spaces in the following sense. If p and q are both infinity, then we retrieve the Helder space. If p and q are both 2 and alpha is an integer m, then we retrieve the Zola space of when p equals 2. If p is not 2, then it is not exactly a Besov space, but we have this sequence of continuous embeddings. So basically, again, this Zola space of order m and parameter p is kind of wedged between two Besov spaces where the q value goes from 1 to infinity. And Another important fact to keep in mind is that alpha needs to be bigger than d divided by p, called d's dimension, and p is the LP value of the smoothness. And this is required because alpha needs to be bigger than this value to ensure that the Besov space compactly embeds into the space of continuous functions. If alpha is smaller than this value, then the Besov space could include functions that are not continuous, and we don't want that here. And the minimax optimal rate in Besov space is known as the following. So if you're not familiar with the minimax optimal rate, basically it tells you it gives you a lower bound for the complexity of learning any function in your given space. It tells you that if you're given n samples, then any estimator that depends on these n samples to compute an estimate for your function, its worst case error will be lower bounded by this rate here in the case of the Besov space. So if you're familiar with this minimax optimal analysis for Sobolev spaces, this is basically the same thing. You have 2 times alpha. Alpha is the smoothness of your Sobolev space. We have 2 alpha over 2 alpha plus d. And so this is the classical rate in Sobolev space. It just generalizes directly to Besov spaces. Okay. And we also consider the so-called B-spline basis, which is a natural basis for the Besov space. This is the diagram that came up from before. The B-spline basis is not actually a completely independent basis. Again, the B-spline basis forms this kind of hierarchy. So how we define this is we first define this iota m function. This is just the m plus 1-fold convolution of the.
I have a question. So there's one thing I missed. I didn't load into my memory. Who's a cal x here though?
Sorry, could you say it again? Cal x?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so cal x is the domain of all your just x values, and here it is just you assume that it's bounded for simplicity. It's in you don't.
Yeah. I only ask because usually you have to modify the wavelet basis if you have like a non-standard domain. Yeah.
You mean for like boundary corrections or?
Yes, if it is. For example, if your domain, for example, if your domain is in like E thick, whatever this means, there's like some wavelet books on this. Then, for example, like yeah, these wavelet bases. I'm not sure what this defines, but typically for the wavelets at least, that won't be like a Schauder basis and things like this. So yeah, just to make a comment. So I think it depends like on the structure of X, how wavelets behave. And I'm not sure what this lines, but I imagine there's something similar.
Yes, I think you're right. I think just the best way is just to assume that X is the
yeah, exactly. This is actually my point. Okay, cool.
Just to not deal with any of those like difficult issues. Oh, and we also need to assume that the distribution on X is bounded below and above to get these like optimal rates.
That's totally reasonable, I think. No one wants point masses here and there.
Okay, so this back to the function. This function is just the indicator function of the interval, and then we convolve it with itself n plus 1 times. So we get this kind of function that converges to like this, a smoother function that converges to the Gaussian after scaling. And then we take this, and then we scale it in each coordinate by this factor 2 to the power of ki. So ki is the resolution in the direction in the ith component. And then we also shift it by L. So L is the location parameter. K is the resolution parameter. And for most of this paper, we just consider all the KIs are equal. K1 to KD are all equal to just 1K. And so that's the K you see here. Here K is 1, K is 2, K is 3, and so on. So every time you increase the resolution, the spline will be squished by a factor of 2 in every direction. And then the location parameters basically tell you that you have the same function just at different locations all over your domain. And you can easily show that these splines are piecewise polynomials, and so they can be efficiently approximated by DNNs with most log depth. Basically means that if you have ReLU DNNs, then it takes log depth to approximate them. If you have, for example, smooth or like sigmoid DNNs, you can actually approximate them with constant depth, I think. ReLU DNNs here, we just use them because used most often in practice, but they actually lead to slightly worse approximation abilities because the functions that can be expressed by Rayleigh DNNs are not smooth. But this is just a caveat. Anyway, so as a reminder, we'll take the Besov space with this B-spline basis as our task class and the basis of psi j. And here we also assume P is greater than or equal than 2. This basically means that we don't have to deal with any like adaptive estimation issues. I'll give a mention of that a bit later. We also assume that alpha is bigger than d over p to again ensure that all these functions are continuous. And that for our basis, we take the B-splines. They're just scaled by this factor in order to ensure that these guys compared these high resolution bases are scaled by a larger number to make sure that their norm is close to 1. And in this setup, we can basically verify all the assumptions from the previous part. The R number, which is basically the growth of your L infinity norm of these base elements, are 1/2. The smoothness, S is the actual smoothness of the Besov space divided by the dimension. And the assumption 3, which basically told you how well your DNN class approximates this basis function, can be verified for any polynomial error by taking a suitable DNN class where depth is again, the depth can be logarithmic in n, the width sparsity, and sorry, I think there's a mistake here. The sparsity should be also log n. But basically, you can approximate this basis class, the space of the basis functions very efficiently using like log n size neural networks. And we can also bound the entropy of this DNN class again, like linearly in n. Should have just explained this a bit better. So since our DNN is like an n-dimensional output, we assume that each coordinate is a DNN, and then we append a clip function to it to get it norm bound. But by taking this Rayleigh DNN, we can compute all these values, the entropy, the delta, and then we plug into our general result from before, and we get the following upper bound. So recall that we had 3 terms, the DNN approximation error, the in-context generation gap, and the pretraining generation gap, and they all work out to be these 3 terms. And if you take a moment to look at the 3rd term, it's n squared divided by t. But if t is large enough, then this can be ignored compared to the first 2 terms. And the first 2 terms are actually just the classical approximation and generalization error for ordinary supervised regression in Besov or Zola space. And by taking n to scale in small n like this in this manner, we can show that the final upper bound achieves the optimal rate, which is n to the power of, again, 2 alpha divided by 2 alpha plus d. So we have shown that if t, the number of pretraining tasks, is large enough, then in-context learning can achieve the Minimax optimal rate in small n. And since in practice, LLMs are basically trained on all text on the internet, we can assume that the number of tasks it sees, t, is basically infinite. And this explains, and thus the conditions are satisfied and the risk bound is optimal. This explains why ICL can be so efficient in practice. However, we also note that if t is small, then the 3rd term cannot be ignored, and then the overall upper bound will be scaling suboptimally. And so this aligns with the so-called task diversity threshold, which was observed in this paper. Basically, they saw that if the transformer, if the model only looks at a few tasks during pre-training, then it does not generalize well. So our upper bound analysis basically tells you why this is happening. But we'll be a bit more rigorous later. As a remark, why I said P needs to be greater or equal to 2 is that if P is smaller than 2, the approximation error will be strictly worse. In the case of supervised regression, this is not true. In the case of supervised regression, DNNs can still achieve the Minimax optimal rate because they can adaptively choose which basis functions to approximate. However, in-context learning cannot do that because it's constrained to, basically, since they cannot update at inference time, they're constrained to non-adaptive representations, and they cannot do this kind of adaptive basis choosing behavior. So when P is smaller than 2, ICL must be bounded below by the best linear approximation rate, which is known as the Kolmogorov width. And this basically scales the approximation error in this case, basically scales suboptimally because we have this additional factor. But this is a technical detail. Basically, when P smaller than 2, the Besov space is no longer convex. It is kind of star-shaped, and then you need some sort of adaptive scheme to reach the optimal rate. So this can be seen as a drawback of having a non-adaptive or like a method that's fixed at inverse time. Okay, so now we looked at the optimality or potential suboptimality of in-context learning. I'll also present some different settings. The first one is, this is kind of trivial, but basically if you look here, the rate depends adversely on the dimension D. Here we have D appear here in the denominator. So basically we have a curse of dimensionality. If the dimension of the data is very high, then the rate will be very slow. And this is kind of unavoidable, no matter what estimator you use, because this is the optimal rate. However, there is a setup called the anisotropic Besov space, where instead of having a single smoothness alpha, we have a different smoothness alpha 1 to alpha d in each coordinate. And in this setting, you can actually show that more generally, the optimal rate will only depend on dimension through this particular kind of aggregated smoothness quantity, which is the harmonic average of all the coordinate-wise smoothness. And if only a few alpha I are small, basically small smoothness means the function is very sensitive to that particular direction. And so that is an important direction. And if only a few directions are important, then this quantity will not depend on dimension, and the final rate will be dimension-free. The final rate will look something like this. It'll be 2 alpha tilde divided by 2 alpha tilde plus 1. So you can see that there's no dimension. And for supervised learning, this has been shown to, this can be understood as explaining the effectiveness of regression or deep learning under the manifold hypothesis. That is, when the data lives in a high-dimensional space, but actually resides or lies very close to a low-dimensional manifold. So the effective dimension is very small, and the rate is faster. And you can see that the same thing can be said for in-context learning, which achieves the which we can show the same theorem. It achieves the Minimax optimal rate. There's also a bit more fun setting, where instead of having just d-dimensional random vectors as your inputs, you can have entire sequences be your inputs. So this setting, I'm calling the sequential input setting, where the inputs are d to the power d times infinity. They are bidirectional sequences of tokens. For example, the inputs can be entire documents. And in this case, in our setting, phi is no longer a ReLU TNN, but phi itself needs to be a multi-layer transformer network. So the entire thing is one huge transformer with a small transformers embedded inside. In this case, the task class is known to be, it's called the gamma smooth function class. This is a very technical concept, so I won't go into detail, but basically it's a class of sequence-to-sequence functions that need to be equivariant. And the idea is that, of course, for transformers, if you shift the input sequence of tokens by 1, then the output should also be just shifted by 1. So you have this natural equivariance. And also, this function class allows smoothness to vary depending on the input, which is very interesting. And this is a closer model to natural language, because if you say have a sentence and then you have important words, but if you take the sentence and input some meaningless strings inside the sentence, if you pad it with meaningless words, then the position of this important word will change. So this gamma smooth function class can.
Question. Actually, on that, so forgetting about smoothness and just thinking about say the basic idea like Lipschitz continuity, or something like that in some uniform continuity. I'm just curious. So typically so what metric structure or norm structure? Okay, what basically who does the sequence space live in? Because for example, an infinite product of R is not a Banach space, typically, so I guess what distance do you have on this? Is it you have the usual inherited pressure norm or metric, sorry, or how do you quantify the closeness of the sequence in this space?
So
Just forgetting about smoothness, I wasn't so clear what the continuity means here.
I don't think the metric structure on X really matters in this setting because you just have different tokens, and then the attention layer basically just takes tokens at different positions and then do some sort of computation.
Yeah, but suppose like you want to approximate a target function that has takes an infinite sequence inside, you know?
Oh,
Like how do
okay.
you quantify like the regularity of this target function if you don't
Okay,
know
so
the metric structure, you know?
so for one, because of equivariance, I said the sequence functions, but the output can just be a single output in R.
Yeah, but the input is like what's the
But
distance
the
of like
input is
yeah.
the input is the sequence space. And I think the answer should be because for the model we consider a sliding window attention. So the model at every time is just looking at a finite subset of the input.
Okay.
So
Okay, maybe I ask you later. Maybe I ask you later. But okay, yeah.
so this is kind of this truncation going on at every step.
Mm. But you see my point because I guess that when you lift back up, and it doesn't matter really.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that makes sense. Uh,
cool.
yeah, but basically the model is always constrained to look at a fixed neighborhood
Hmm.
of the token you're looking at. Oh, no, I remember now. Sorry, it's been a while since I read this paper. But basically, the smoothness is required to like go to infinity as you go further and further from the origin,
Mm.
because you can't have all the infinite tokens have the same smoothness.
Okay.
And so in the end, you're basically looking at like you basically only need to look at a neighborhood of the origin.
Okay. Cool.
Was is the general idea. But okay, so in this setting, phi is taken to be a class of multi-head, multi-layer sliding window self-adapting transformers uh, that are defined like this. I won't go into the details, but by taking the class of networks as the transformer class, we can again do this kind of approximation generalization gap analysis and end up again with these three terms here, the approximation error, the in-context generalization gap, and the pretraining generalization gap. And here we have the same story. If t is large enough, then this third term can be ignored. And then we again have this optimal bias variance trade-off. And so this tells us that ICL can be further efficient even for sequential data whose length can go to infinity. Uh, uh, I do say here that the context window can also go to infinity, but the to be precise, the rate does not depend on the context window, but the constants will depend on the context window. So you can't just say you're looking at the whole infinite length sequence. So there's some technicalities there. Anyway, so far we have seen some different settings where we can also show in-context learning is optimal. Uh, but now we also ask, is there a setting where in-context learning actually improves upon the ordinary regression rate? Because like if it's all the same rate, then one could argue that, okay, well, in-context learning is optimal, that's great, but can't you just, throw away all your pre-training data, just look at your end samples and do your ordinary supervised regression with deep neural networks and still get the same optimal rate? And that is true. But we now look at a setting where in-context learning actually helps. So now you assume that the basis function, psi j, is not the natural B-spline basis, but is now unknown and chosen from a wider Besov space with smoothness tau. Here the smoothness is smaller than the smoothness alpha of the original decay rate. So this is a wider space, a coarser space, if you will. And in this space, since you don't know what your basis functions look like in this space, your target function can also be anything in this wider space. And so the complexity of just doing supervised ordinary regression is a priori lower bounded by the slower rate in tau. But for in-context learning, you can again do this whole analysis and get these three terms. And again, all this difficulty due to this additional term tau is entirely carried by t. So if you look at the third term, again, if t is large enough, this will disappear. And then if you complete the balance of the first two terms, you again get the minimax optimum rate alpha, the faster rate. And so basically, what's happening here intuitively is that by pre-training in-context learning can, the transformer can encode information on this unknown, this coarser basis in the deep neural network. And so this is also the power of representation learning. Basically, by learning good representations for your tasks in question during pretraining, you can do better at the inference time. Okay. Finally, we want to discuss some lower bounds for meta learning, because all the optimality results for now have come with a bit of a caveat, because our upper bounds are basically for the transformer model, which takes as input not just the n tokens of the current task, but also the t times n tokens of all the relevant tasks that are given to it during pre-training. And so even if we say that the n to the power of minus 2 alpha or 2 alpha plus d is the minimax optimal rate, that's only the minimax optimal rate for a learner that's only looking at the n samples. So we actually want a lower bound for a meta learner, which has access to not just the n samples, but all the nt related samples as well. So we prove a more rigorous lower bound in that setting by using the Yang-Baer method. As a caveat here, we assume Gaussian noise. On all the previous results, we assume bounded noise. So there's a bit of a separation there. But we have this result that looks like a Yang-Baer result. I won't go into details because in the end, you actually have to compute all these covering numbers, packing numbers to get a bound. But I'll just show you the results of what happens if we apply this to the previous concrete settings. And yeah, if you apply this result to the previous settings for the regression in Besov space, we just get the optimum rate in n. So surprisingly, this tells us that the t does not actually matter here. Basically, whether you do in-context learning with access to all these t tasks, or you just do ordinary regression with just your n samples of the current task, you get the same rate. So this is slightly anticlimactic, but this also shows that in-context learning is provably optimal in a large T regime with respect to both N and T. Because we showed that if T is large, then in-context learning can actually achieve this rate. And the same thing can be said for the anisotropic Besov space and the transformers and gamma smooth class setting. We all retrieve the optimal rate in N. What's more interesting is the coarser basis setting, which let's just go slightly back to remind ourselves, is where the basis is unknown and chosen from a wider Besov space. And in this case, you can actually show that the lower bound depends on an anti like this. And if you see here, we have the faster rate in alpha here, and the slow rate in tau is applied to the n times t part. It's interesting because that means that if t is small, if t is like 0.1, if you have access to only a few example tasks during pre-training, then the slower term will dominate and actually show that the in-context learning is provably suboptimal. Not just in-context learning, but any meta learner that can utilize the n times t example tokens however you wish, they're all lower bounded by this slower rate. But if t is large enough, if t is larger than, I can do this in my head, but if t is larger than a certain threshold in n, then the first term will dominate. And so we achieve the faster optimal rate in alpha. So this again shows you that this rate in-context learning becomes optimal when t is large. So now we have rigorously established some kind of threshold. If t is too small, then in-context learning is provably suboptimal. If t is large enough, then in-context learning is provably optimal. So there is an explicit threshold there, which aligns with, again, the empirical result by Raptas et al. Okay, so now let's go on to the conclusion. We studied ICL of a transformer consisting of a deep neural network and a linear attention layer, pre-trained on tasks from a nonparametric regression task function class. And we first obtained a general upper bound and also a method for obtaining lower bounds using the Yang-Baer method. And we applied that to show that in-context learning can actually achieve nearly minimax optimal rates up to logarithmic factors in the Besov space, in the anisotropic Besov space, and also the gamma smooth function class. And moreover, we also demonstrated that in-context learning can improve upon the optimal rate in certain settings by learning informative representations on the unknown basis during pre-training. Now, our results have a couple limitations. One is that the upper and lower bounds don't match in the coarser basis setting. You see here, the upper bound basically depends on t, like 1 over t, but the lower bound depends, excuse me, the lower bound depends on t through the n times t factor. So there is a kind of gap there, which we couldn't resolve while we were writing this paper. There is a gap between the upper and lower bounds. And also there is a gap in the sense that we do not know where exactly this task diversity threshold exists. Basically, you can show that this rate dominates if t is sufficiently large enough in the sense of the lower bound, and we can also look at the upper bound and show that ICL is optimal if t is larger than this number here, but they do not match. So there is also a suppression there. So we showed the existence of a diversity threshold, but right now we don't know where exactly it is. So it'll be interesting for future work to get a more precise analysis of this part. Okay, so here are my references, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much. Personally, I find it's a really, really nice talk. So let me just ask the audience, are there any questions from the audience? Okay, I guess not. Actually, to be honest, I was going to ask you exactly about the gap between upper and lower bounds. That was my main question. But since you already discussed it, I have no more questions. But yeah, so maybe I just ask you like a broad question. So what kind, I don't know, what kind of questions that are on your mind for like the future? I don't know, like what's an interesting follow-up question? Because it seems like you've addressed pretty much every single aspect. I don't know, you and your co-authors.
Well, so the biggest thing we had was this exact gap here. We're not quite sure where it comes from, but there's one gap, which is this n squared. Okay, so one gap is this. Where is it? Sorry, we have to go back a while. Okay, so if you look at the pre-training generation gap, it's n squared divided by t, but the n squared basically comes from having to learn the attention matrix, which is of size n squared. But you can actually cheat by saying that, well, I know my basis is nearly orthonormal, and we actually just need a diagonal matrix. And so this factor can be improved by a large n divided by t.
Okay.
But even in that case, there's still a gap. So we're not quite sure where it arises.
That's interesting, actually.
And of course, there's some more meta question of does this actually matter in the sense of trying to understand in context learning, because actually transformers, they have more than one attention layer, of course.
Yeah, I didn't want to ask this question, but yes.
And there have been so after this paper went out, there have been.
Can I make a small comment on that?
Oh yeah, sure.
So one thing I think is like, interesting from like when you talk to because people are more practitioner, typically apparently the number of attention heads per block is apparently one of the most like the largest deciding factor on like empirical expressivity. But I think here typically one always has like one attention head, you know. Yeah, so I just want to make there's this comment, you know. But personally, I don't know how to resolve this. I thought about it recently a bit, but yeah, just a comment. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. So I was thinking of is there a way to actually quantify like what the optimal number of heads, in the sense that you could increase the number of heads, but then decrease the dimension of each head, the embedding dimension of each head, so that the number of parameters is constant. But then you have this trade-off between the rank of your embeddings, and then like how many different tasks you can expect. And I know there have been some new papers which do consider like multi-head attention, for in-context learning specifically, and so that like each head learns a different aspect of the task. So that's definitely an interesting thing.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. So I'll just say, thanks again for the talk. One person in the comment asked if you can make the slides available. The YouTube video is available, but I guess if you wanted to.
Sure. I'll send you by email, and then you can.
Sure. That also works. Okay. Cool. In that case, thanks again, and probably see you at